If you stand on Collins Avenue in Sunny Isles Beach and look east, you will see a wall of glass towers worth more than most countries' housing stock. Some of the condos inside sold for over $40 million. And in 2024, a team of scientists pointed a satellite at those buildings and discovered something the brochures never mentioned. They are going down, not falling, not collapsing, sinking, quietly, by millimeters a year, into ground that was never solid to begin with. A study out of the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School, published at the end of 2024, used satellite radar to measure vertical movement along a 12-mile stretch of Barrier Island from Sunny Isles Beach down through Surfside and Miami Beach. It found 35 buildings that had subsided between 2 and 8 centimeters between 1996 and 2023. Some of the most recognizable luxury addresses in South Florida were on the list, and the researchers were clear that in several cases the movement had not stopped. 2 to 8 centimeters does not sound like much. An inch, 3 inches, you would not notice it walking through a lobby, but a building is not supposed to move at all, and when it does, it almost never moves evenly. One side settles faster than the other. Concrete does not bend, it cracks. And on this particular strip of sand, 3 miles from where those satellites were pointed, everyone already knows what a crack in a beachfront condo can mean. Here is what makes Miami different from every other troubled coastline in America. In Malibu, the ocean attacks from the front, and you can at least imagine building a wall. In Miami, the ocean comes up from underneath. The barrier islands sit on porous limestone that behaves less like bedrock and more like a hard sponge. Water moves through it. Salt moves through it. You can build a seawall 100 feet tall, and the sea will simply walk under it and come up through the parking garage. There is no wall for this. There is no engineering fix an individual owner can buy. And that is before you get to the part where, legally and financially, the owner of a $40 million condominium may have less control over their own building than the owner of a mobile home. This is the story of how the most glamorous coastline in the United States was built on ground nobody tested, how a single night in 2021 changed the rules for every condo owner in Florida, and why the people who own the most expensive vertical real estate in the South cannot do anything about what is happening under their feet. To understand why Miami Beach is in trouble, you have to understand that most of it should not exist. Go back far enough, and this was not a coastline of dunes and bluffs. It was mangrove swamp and sandbar, a thin ridge of sand and tangled root separating Biscayne Bay from the Atlantic. It was not developable land. It was barely land. What turned it into land was a dredge. Beginning in the 1910s, developers pumped material off the bottom of Biscayne Bay and sprayed it over the mangroves until there was something firm enough to survey. Entire neighborhoods, entire islands in that bay are fill, manufactured ground placed there roughly a century ago, sitting on top of natural sediment that was already soft, sitting on top of limestone that is riddled with holes. Now here is the part that matters. Fill settles. It is not a defect. It is physics. Loose sediment placed under its own weight compresses over decades as water is squeezed out of the spaces between grains. Add a 30-story tower on top, and you accelerate it. Engineers know this. It is why deep foundations exist, why you drive piles down through the soft stuff to something that will hold. The question is never whether the ground compresses. The question is whether the building was designed for it, whether the piles reached what they were supposed to reach, and whether every part of the structure settles at the same rate. That 2024 Subsidence study is unsettling for a very specific reason. The researchers noted that the sinking was not confined to buildings from a single era, and in some cases the movement appeared to continue long after construction, when conventional wisdom says settlement should have tapered off. They also raised the possibility that construction activity next door, vibration, dewatering, driving new piles for the next tower, may be shaking sediment loose under buildings that were already there. In other words, on a coastline where a new luxury tower goes up every 18 months, your neighbor's foundation work may be part of your building's problem, and nobody is going to send you a letter about it. Layer on top of that the second problem, the one everybody in South Florida can see with their own eyes. The ocean is rising, and it is rising here faster than the global average because of local factors, including ocean current changes and the land itself settling. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration projections have put roughly a foot of additional sea level rise along U.S. coastlines by 2050. And along the southeast Florida coast, regional planners have been working from numbers in that same range for years. You do not need to model the year 2100 to see the effect. You can just wait for autumn. every year around the king tides, when the moon and the sun and the orbit line up, salt water rises through the storm drains and the porous rock and comes up through the street. Not from rain, not from a storm. From below, on a cloudless afternoon. Miami Beach has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on a stormwater program to fight it. Dozens of pumps, elevated roads, raised seawalls, a program that has been running since 2014 and has been controversial, expensive, and never finished. And that is a city with money doing everything right. The individual condo owner has none of those tools. So you have soft ground, sinking buildings, and a rising water table full of salt. And salt water is the thing you least want touching a Florida condominium because these towers are built out of reinforced concrete, steel bars inside concrete. Concrete is strong, and steel is strong, and together they are stronger than either alone, but only as long as the concrete keeps the steel dry. When chloride from salt spray and salt water works into the concrete through cracks or porous patches, the steel begins to corrode. Corroding steel expands. Expanding steel cracks the concrete from the inside, and the crack lets in more salt water. Engineers call it spalling. It is a self-feeding loop. It is invisible from the outside until it is not, and it lives in exactly the places nobody inspects. The pool deck, the balcony edges, the garage ceiling, the roof slab. Every stain on a parking garage ceiling in South Florida is a story about that loop. For decades, this was treated as a maintenance headache. In the mid-1970s, after a building collapse in downtown Miami killed several people, Miami-Dade County put in place one of the first rules of its kind in the country, a recertification requirement forcing older buildings to be inspected and repaired at 40 years. It was ahead of its time. It also had a fatal weakness. An inspection tells you what needs fixing. It does not give you the money to fix it. And in a condominium, the money does not come from a landlord or a corporation. It comes from a vote. That is the trap at the center of this entire story, and it is worth being precise about it. When you buy a condominium, you own the air inside your walls. You do not own the roof, the foundation, the garage, the seawall, or the columns holding up your ceiling. Those belong to everyone, collectively, through the association, which means you cannot repair them alone, even if you have the money and the will. You need your neighbors to agree, and your neighbors include retirees on fixed incomes who bought in 1988, investors renting units by the week who will never set foot in the building, and absentee owners overseas who do not answer email. Every dollar of major repair has to survive that room. And for 40 years, in thousands of buildings, the room voted the same way. Defer it, waive the reserves, keep the monthly fee low, protect the resale value. Nobody was being villainous, everybody was being human, and the deferral compounded silently in the concrete. Then, on the night of June 24, 2021, Champlain Towers South in Surfside, a 12-story oceanfront condominium completed in 1981, collapsed. 98 people were killed. It remains one of the deadliest structural failures in American history, and the loss for those families is not something any video can measure or should try to. What can be said is this: investigators from the National Institute of Standards and Technology launched a full federal investigation, the most extensive of its kind since the World Trade Center, and it is still ongoing. What was public almost immediately, though, was the paper trail. An engineer's report years earlier had documented major structural damage in the pool deck and garage. Estimated repair costs had escalated into the tens of millions. The association had been working through the financing. The work had not been completed. A settlement of more than $1 billion was later approved for victims and families. Here is what that night did to every other condominium in Florida. It ended the vote. In 2022, the state legislature passed what became known as Senate Bill 4D, and it removed the deferral option from the hands of owners entirely. Condominiums 3 stories and taller now face milestone structural inspections at 30 years of age, 25 if they sit within 3 miles of the coastline, and then on a recurring cycle after that. And crucially, associations must commission a structural integrity reserve study covering the roof, load-bearing walls, the foundation, plumbing, electrical, waterproofing, and more, and then actually fund those reserves. The old escape hatch, where a majority of owners could simply vote to waive reserve funding year after year, was closed. Later legislation in 2025 softened the timeline and gave associations some additional flexibility in financing options, but it did not reverse the principle. The bill comes due now, in cash, whether the owners voted for it or not. Think about what that means arithmetically. Most of the condominium stock in Miami-Dade is old. A large majority of the buildings went up before the 1990s, many in the boom decades of the 1970s and 80s. Every one of them is now over the age threshold. Every one of them has to be inspected. And decades of deferred maintenance do not get cheaper by waiting. Concrete restoration on a saltwater exposed tower is one of the most expensive things you can do to a building, involving scaffolding the entire facade, chipping out damaged concrete, treating or replacing steel, and rebuilding balconies one by one. So the letters started arriving. Special assessments, one-time bills split among owners to cover work the reserves could not. Across South Florida, assessments in the tens of thousands per unit became routine, and in older buildings needing full structural restoration, six-figure bills per unit have been widely reported. Imagine being 81 years old, living on Social Security, in a two-bedroom unit your husband bought in 1984 with a paid-off mortgage, and receiving a notice that your share of the repair is more money than you have ever had at one time. You cannot vote it down. You cannot opt out. You cannot fix your own unit and let the building rot because the thing that needs fixing is the building. If you do not pay, the association can place a lien on your home. The obvious answer is to sell. And this is where the trap closes completely because the same forces are hitting the exit at the same time. Buyers of condominiums usually need financing, and mortgage financing in this country flows through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. After Surfside, those agencies tightened their questionnaires on condominium projects: structural safety, deferred maintenance, reserve funding, pending special assessments. Buildings that cannot answer satisfactorily land on an ineligibility list, and the reported number of buildings on it climbed into the thousands nationally, with Florida heavily represented. A unit in a building on that list cannot be bought with a conventional mortgage. The buyer pool shrinks to cash. Cash buyers know exactly why they are the only ones in the room, and they price accordingly. Now add insurance. Florida has some of the highest property insurance costs in the country, and after a run of hurricane seasons and reinsurance shocks, master policy premiums for coastal condominium associations surged, in many buildings, doubling or worse within a few years. That cost does not go on the building's bill, it goes on the monthly fee. So the maintenance fee climbs, the assessment lands, the financing dries up, and the listing sits. Through 2024 and 2025, Miami condominium inventory piled up while sales slowed, and prices in the older segment came under real pressure. In a market that had spent 30 years going only one direction, older waterfront condos became the thing nobody wanted. And here is the twist that almost nobody outside Florida has heard about. There is a way out of a condominium that has become financially unfixable, and it is not a sale, it is called termination. Under Florida law, an association can be dissolved and the entire property sold as a single parcel to a developer, subject to statutory approval thresholds. For the developer, this is extraordinary. An oceanfront lot with an obsolete building on it, in the most supply-constrained market in the region. For the owner, it means that after decades of ownership, the decision to keep your home may ultimately not be yours. If enough of your neighbors want out, and after a six-figure assessment many of them desperately do, the building goes. You get a check based on an appraised value in a distressed market, and the address where you raised your children becomes a sales gallery with a rendering out front. Bulk buyout offers have been circling aging beachfront buildings across South Florida for exactly this reason. The pressure of the concrete becomes the pressure of the vote, and the vote becomes a demolition permit. Meanwhile, on the ocean side, the beach itself is running on a subscription. Miami Beach's famous sand is not entirely natural in its current form. Much of it has been placed there, and it has been replaced repeatedly since a major federal renourishment project in the 1970s, because the Atlantic keeps taking it back. That project needs sand, and Miami-Dade County has essentially exhausted the good offshore sand within reach. So the sand now comes overland, trucked in from inland mines in central Florida, or dredged from further away at greater cost, hauled down the highway and spread on the beach so that the beach can exist for the next storm to remove it. Every grain of it is a recurring bill with no end date, exactly like the pumps under the streets, exactly like the milestone inspections, exactly like the reserve funding. Nothing here is ever fixed. Everything here is only ever paused. And through all of it, the towers keep going up. That is the part that is hardest to square. In the same years the subsidence study was published, in the same years the assessments were landing and the inventory was climbing, developers were launching branded ultra-luxury towers along this exact coastline at price points that make $40 million look conventional. The buyers at that level are not financing through Fannie Mae. They are not worried about a maintenance fee. Many are not going to live there full-time, and they are being sold, quite literally, the newest construction on the oldest problem, buildings engineered to modern codes with modern foundations, which is genuinely better, standing on the same porous rock, facing the same rising water table, on an island that the satellites say is not holding perfectly still. So what does an owner actually do? Really, walk through the options. You cannot build a barrier because the water comes up through the ground. You cannot fix your building alone because you do not own the parts that are failing. You cannot vote to wait because the state took that away after 98 people died. You cannot sell easily because the financing pipeline and the insurance market have both closed around your building's age. You cannot refuse the assessment because there is a lien waiting. And you cannot necessarily refuse to leave because your neighbors may terminate the association out from under you. The $40 million penthouse and the $200,000 unit 20 floors below are trapped by the same mechanism in different denominations. The tragedy of Miami is that none of the underlying science was ever secret. The porosity of the limestone was known. The behavior of dredged fill was known. Chloride attack on reinforced concrete is a solved problem in engineering literature and has been for half a century. There are coatings, cathodic protection systems, inspection regimes, and design specifications that address it. The rate of local sea level rise has been measured continuously at tide gauges for decades. Every single ingredient of this situation was documented, published, and available. What was missing was not information. What was missing was any structure in which somebody had both the authority and the incentive to act on it before it became an emergency. Developers build and leave, associations turn over every few years, owners vote for the lowest monthly fee, regulators inspect but do not pay, and the concrete just sits there, absorbing salt, keeping score. There is a version of this coastline that could have worked. Deeper foundations as a default rather than a premium. Mandatory funded reserves from the first day of every association, sized to the actual life of the actual materials in a marine environment. Recurring structural inspection from year 1 rather than year 40. Building elevations set against the sea level of the year the building will die, not the year it was permitted. None of it is exotic. All of it costs money at the front end, which is the one moment in the life of a building when nobody wants to spend it. Instead, the cost got pushed forward, decade after decade, association after association, vote after vote, until it landed all at once on whoever happened to be holding the keys in the 2020s. That is what a deferred bill does. It does not disappear. It waits, and it finds an owner. So here is what I keep coming back to. The satellites will keep watching. The next study will have another few years of data in it, and we will learn whether those 35 buildings settled and stopped, or settled and kept going. The milestone inspections will keep landing on desks. The tide gauges will keep climbing. And every autumn, the water will come up through the storm drains on a sunny day and stand in the street for a few hours, the way it has been doing for years, while people take pictures of it and drive around it and go on with their lives. What do you think should happen here? Should the state be doing more to help owners who did nothing wrong except buy into a building somebody else neglected for 40 years? Or is that just the deal you sign when you buy a share of a concrete box on a barrier island? And would you personally put $1 into an oceanfront condo in South Florida right now at any price? Let me know in the comments.